He cleaned his father's barns after his death. The day the will was read, Daniel's world cracked open like a dropped plate. His stepbrothers walked away with the estate, the company shares, the lake house, the European cars. He got two collapsing barns at the edge of an overgrown field and a roomful of laughter pressed against his back. But when he stepped into that first barn, boots sinking into damp straw, something felt wrong. The walls held their breath. The rafters creaked when there was no wind, and under the smell of mildew and old leather, a secret waited for him alone, the one his father had buried where no one else would think to look. Before we go any further, we'd love for you to hit that subscribe button. Your support means the world to us and helps us bring you even more powerful stories like this one. Now, let's begin. The chapel smelled of cold lilies and floor polish. Daniel sat in the third row, jaw locked so tight his temples throbbed. His father's casket rested at the front, dark walnut with brass handles, surrounded by people who'd only ever called when they needed money. The pastor's voice drifted somewhere above him, soft and rehearsed, and Daniel caught fragments of whispers from the row behind him. They say the older boys are getting the firm. A low laugh. What's the youngest one getting then? A pity check. Daniel didn't turn around. He'd been swallowing those whispers his entire life. After the burial, the family gathered in the long drawing room of the estate house. Rain tapped against the bay windows. The lawyer, a thin man with hands that trembled slightly when he turned the pages, cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. According to the final testament of Charles Whitmore, he began, and the room leaned in like a single body. The estate house, the firm, the holdings on Madison Avenue, all transferred to the sons of his first marriage. Daniel's stepmother smoothed the hem of her black dress with a small, satisfied breath. His two stepbrothers exchanged a look that needed no words. Then came the pause. And to Daniel Whitmore, the lawyer said, his eyes flicking up uncertainly, the property at the western boundary, the farmhouse and adjoining barns. Silence stretched. Then it broke. His older stepbrother snorted into his hand. The barns. The younger one tilted his head back and laughed, a sharp single bark that bounced off the high ceiling. Guess that's where you belong, Danny, with the rats. Their mother folded her hands neatly in her lap and offered Daniel a thin, performative smile. Your father was sentimental about that old land, she said. He always thought you had a country soul. The way she said country, it sounded like an insult dressed in lace. The lawyer tried to keep going, but the words slid past Daniel like rain off glass. He stared at the single page in front of him, two short paragraphs, signed by the same father who taught him to braid rope and identify constellations from the loft of that very barn. Outside, thunder rolled across the hills. Daniel pushed his chair back. The legs scraped against the polished oak floor and every head in the room turned. I'll take what's mine, he said, his voice low and even. No one stopped him. No one wished him luck. As he reached the door, he heard his stepmother murmur something to her sons that made them laugh again, softer this time, like they were tucking the joke away to enjoy later. The rain hit him the moment he stepped outside, cool and clean against his burning face. He sat in his truck for a long minute before turning the key, the folded deed resting on the passenger seat beside him, smudged with the imprint of his thumb. He looked at it. 2 barns, a farmhouse, a patch of land everyone else had written off. He let out a slow breath that fogged the windshield. All right, Dad, he whispered. Let's see what you really left me. The engine turned over with a familiar rumble, and the headlights cut twin paths through the falling dark as he drove west toward the only inheritance no one had wanted to claim. By the time Daniel reached the property line, the rain had thinned to a slow, steady drizzle. The dirt road curved through a stand of pines, and then the land opened up the way he remembered it from boyhood. A long, sloping field, the farmhouse rising at the far end with its peeling white paint and crooked porch. And beyond it, 2 weathered barns standing side by side like old brothers leaning into each other for support. The headlights swept across them, and for a moment Daniel just sat there, both hands resting on the wheel, listening to the rain tap against the roof of the truck. He stepped out into mud that pulled at his boots. The smell hit him before anything else, wet hay, rust, old machine oil, and that particular sweetness of cedar planks that had been weathered by 100 winters. It was the smell of his childhood, the smell of summers he'd almost convinced himself he'd imagined. He walked toward the first barn slowly, hands in the pockets of his coat, feeling the deed crinkle against his fingers. The door was held shut by a length of frayed rope looped around a rusted nail. He untied it carefully, and the door swung open with a long, low groan that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the hinges. Dust drifted up in a slow curtain, catching the beam of his flashlight. Cobwebs hung from the rafters like forgotten lace. Stacks of hay bales, dark with age, lined one wall. An old tractor sat hunched in the corner, its tires gone soft, its paint flaked away to bare metal. A workbench ran along the back, scattered with tools that hadn't been touched in years. Daniel stood in the doorway for a long moment, just breathing it in. Then he stepped inside. His boots crunched on loose grain and old straw. He ran his flashlight along the walls slowly, the way you'd read a letter you weren't sure you wanted to finish. "Nobody's been in here for a long time," he said quietly, mostly to himself. His voice came back to him in a soft echo from the rafters. He found an old push broom leaning against the wall, its bristles half worn down, and he set to work. There was something about the simple motion of it, the steady scrape against the plank floor, that began to settle the storm in his chest. Each sweep stirred a new ghost. A child's wooden whistle half buried in straw, a faded feed sack stamped with his father's initials, a coiled length of leather harness, soft and dark with old oil. He stopped when he found a small leather glove sized for a boy of maybe 10. He turned it over in his hand. It was his own. He remembered the summer he'd lost it, how he'd cried until his father had crouched down and said, "Things have a way of coming back when they're ready, son." He set the glove on the workbench and kept sweeping. Hours passed. The drizzle outside slowed and stopped, and pale morning light began to leak through the gaps in the boards, drawing thin gold lines across the dust. His shoulders ached. His palms burned where the broom handle had rubbed them raw. But he kept going, room by room, corner by corner, until the back half of the barn looked almost livable again. At some point he laughed quietly to himself, a tired, honest sound. "You really did leave me a project, Dad." He was bent over the workbench, wiping it down with an old rag when he heard the crunch of tires on the gravel road outside. He stilled. Through a knothole in the wall, he watched a silver sedan roll slowly past the gate, then stop. His older stepbrother stepped out, sunglasses on despite the gray sky, followed by their mother in a long beige coat. They didn't come any closer. They just stood at the edge of the property, surveying the land the way appraisers survey a foreclosure. "He can keep the barns," the stepbrother said, his voice carrying easily across the wet field. "They'll fall down on their own by Christmas." His mother gave a small, amused hum. "Your father had a soft spot for ruined things," she said. Daniel didn't move. He stood in the dim of the barn with the rag still in his hand and listened to the soft slam of car doors, the crunch of tires turning back toward the road, and the slow return of silence. Then he set the rag down, and for the first time since the funeral, he didn't feel humiliated. He felt awake. Daniel stood there for a long moment after the car was gone, listening to the slow drip of water from the eaves. Something in him had shifted. The shame that had clung to him like a second coat through the funeral, through the will reading, through every soft, cruel laugh in that drawing room, had begun to harden into something else. Not anger exactly, something quieter and more useful. The kind of resolve a man finds when he stops waiting to be invited to his own life. He turned back to the barn and kept working. The sun climbed slowly, breaking through the clouds in long pale shafts that lit the floating dust like falling snow. He worked through the morning without stopping, pulling rotted boards from the corner stalls, dragging out broken crates and tangled spools of barbed wire. He found things that made him pause. A child's slingshot, the rubber long since dried and split. A tin coffee can full of bent horseshoe nails his father used to save for reasons he never explained. A folded square of canvas with the words Whitmore Family Farm hand stitched along the bottom edge. By midday he was leaning against the workbench, drinking warm water from a thermos when his eyes drifted to the back wall. He frowned. He set the thermos down and walked slowly toward it. Something about the boards there had been bothering him without him realizing it. The grain didn't quite match the rest of the wall. The seams were too clean. The nails along one vertical line were brighter than the ones around them, the kind of brightness that came from being pulled and replaced rather than left alone for decades. He pressed his palm flat against the wood. It felt solid. He pressed again, harder, sliding his hand down toward the floor. And then he felt it. A faint give. Not much. Just enough to tell him the wall wasn't a wall. He stepped back and studied it the way a man studies a face he half remembers. Then he went to the workbench, picked up a flat-headed pry bar and slid it gently into the seam. The board came loose with a soft sigh. Behind it was a narrow recess, no wider than his shoulders, lined with cedar planks that smelled clean and dry even after all these years. And inside the recess, resting on a small wooden shelf, was a heavy iron strongbox. It was the size of a large book, painted black, scuffed at the corners, with a brass keyhole worn smooth by use. On top of the box, held down by a smooth river stone, was a folded square of paper. Daniel's hands were unsteady when he picked it up. He recognized the paper before he unfolded it, the same cream-colored stock his father had always used for important letters, the kind he kept in the top drawer of his desk. He unfolded it slowly. His father's handwriting filled the page, strong and slanted and unmistakable. "Son," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone and you've done what I always trusted you would do. You came home. The world out there is loud, Daniel, and your stepmother is louder than most of it. She'll have made sure the loudest things go to her loudest sons. Let her have them. The loudest things break first. What I built that matters, the part that took 40 years and a clear head and your mother's blessing, I put somewhere quiet. Somewhere only a son who still remembers how to use his hands would think to look. The key is where we used to count stars. Don't open the box until you're alone and the doors are shut. And Daniel, whatever you do next, do it the way I taught you, slowly, honestly, and without apologizing for taking up the room you were always meant to take." Daniel read the letter twice, then a third time. His throat had gone tight and his eyes burned, but he didn't cry. He folded the paper carefully and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat, close to his chest. Then he looked up at the rafters. He knew exactly where his father meant. The loft. The narrow ladder in the corner. The flat plank near the small square window where, on warm summer nights when Daniel was small, the two of them had climbed up with a blanket and his father had pointed out the constellations one by one. Daniel set the strongbox carefully on the workbench and crossed the barn to the ladder in the far corner. It was an old thing, hand-built from rough planks his grandfather had nailed together long before Daniel was born. He tested the first rung with his weight. It held. He climbed slowly, the wood groaning softly under his boots, the smell of old hay growing stronger with every step. The loft was smaller than he remembered, or maybe he was just bigger. The ceiling sloped low above his head, and the small square window at the far end let in a single shaft of pale afternoon light. Dust hung in it like suspended water. The floor was scattered with loose straw and a few forgotten things, an old horseshoe, a coil of twine, a child's wooden top with the paint long worn away. He knelt down where the light fell and ran his hand slowly across the planks. He found the loose one almost immediately. It was the same plank his father used to lean back against on summer nights, propped on his elbows with one knee drawn up, pointing at the sky and nomming things. Orion, Cassiopeia, the slow-turning wheel of the Big Dipper. The plank had always wobbled slightly when they sat on it. Daniel had thought, as a boy, that it was just old. He understood now that his father had loosened it on purpose. He worked his fingers under the edge and lifted. The plank came up easily, smooth from years of being moved. Beneath it, nestled in a small hollow lined with oilcloth, lay a single brass key on a leather cord. Daniel picked it up. The metal was cool and heavy in his palm, polished from handling. He held it up to the window. Light caught along its edge. He climbed back down the ladder more slowly than he'd gone up. The strongbox sat waiting on the workbench, exactly where he'd left it. He glanced at the barn doors, still open to the muddy field outside, and walked over and pulled them shut. The hinges complained. A heavy wooden bar dropped into its bracket with a satisfying thud. The inside of the barn went dim and quiet, lit only by the long, pale stripes of light that leaked through the gaps in the boards. He stood in front of the strongbox for a moment, just breathing. Then he slid the key into the lock and turned it. The mechanism gave with a soft click that seemed louder than it was. Inside the box, everything was wrapped carefully in oilcloth. He lifted the contents out one piece at a time and laid them along the workbench in the order he found them. A thick manila envelope, sealed with red wax. A small black ledger with a worn cloth cover. A leather folder tied shut with a length of twine. A second smaller envelope marked with a single word in his father's handwriting, Daniel. And at the bottom of the box, wrapped separately in its own cloth, a small black cassette recorder with a tape already loaded inside. He sat down slowly on an overturned crate, his hands resting on his knees, and looked at the row of objects in front of him. He didn't know which to open first. He thought about the letter in his pocket, slowly, honestly. He picked up the leather folder and untied the twine. Inside was a stack of documents, each one neatly clipped, each one stamped with notary seals and dated across the last decade. The top page was titled in bold print across the top, Articles of Incorporation, Whitmore Land and Holdings, LLC. Daniel's eyes traveled down the page and stopped at the line that listed the principal member. The name printed there was his own. He sat very still. He read the line again to be sure. Daniel Whitmore, sole managing member. Established 11 years ago. He turned the page. The next document was a deed of transfer, signed and notarized, conveying a parcel of land into the holdings of that same LLC. He read the parcel description twice before he understood what he was looking at. It was not just the farm. It was the land beneath the estate house, the land beneath the lake property, the land beneath the office tower his stepbrothers had inherited that morning. His father hadn't given him the barns. His father had given him the ground they all stood on. Daniel didn't move for a long time. The papers sat on his knees and the dust drifted slow through the bars of light, and somewhere outside a crow called once and fell silent. He read the deed again, then the deed under it, then the one under that. They were all the same shape. Different addresses, different parcel numbers, the same name at the bottom. Whitmore Land and Holdings, LLC. Sole managing member, Daniel Whitmore. His father had spent 11 years quietly moving the ground out from under his stepmother's feet, one parcel at a time, and she had never noticed because she had never thought to look down. He set the deeds aside and reached for the black ledger. It was the kind of book his father had always carried in his coat pocket, plain and cloth bound, the pages soft from being turned. Daniel opened it. Every page was filled with his father's careful handwriting. Dates running down the left margin, notes running across. Met with Halbert at the bank this morning, the first entry read. Began transfer of the western parcel. Marriage to E has not improved. She moved another $12,000 from the household account this month. He spoke to a lawyer about a separate trust for Daniel. Daniel turned the page slowly. The entries went on for years. His father had recorded everything. Every transfer his stepmother had made from the family accounts. Every check she had written to her sons that she had hidden from the books. Every quiet conversation she had thought was private. He had written down dates, amounts, names of the people she had met with. There were pages where his father simply wrote, "She thinks I don't know." There were pages where he wrote, "Daniel called tonight. He sounded tired. I should have called him first." Daniel had to set the ledger down for a moment. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes and breathed slowly until his chest stopped shaking. Then he picked it up again and kept reading. The last entry was dated 3 weeks before his father had died. The handwriting was thinner than it had been on the earlier pages, but it was still the same hand. Filed the final amendment today, it read, "Everything is in place. If she contests, the ledger will speak for me. Tell Daniel I'm sorry I waited so long to tell him. Tell him the barn knows." Daniel closed the ledger carefully and set it on the workbench. He sat for a while with his hands folded in his lap. Then he reached for the small envelope with his name on it. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a flash drive taped to the bottom of it. The note was short. "Daniel, the bank box at First Valley is in your name. The key is taped behind the picture of your mother in the farmhouse hallway. The flash drive has copies of everything in case the originals are taken. Trust Margaret at the law office on Pine Street. She has been waiting for you. Don't go to the estate house alone. Love, Dad." Daniel folded the note and put it in his coat pocket with the first one. Then he reached for the cassette recorder. He set it on the workbench and pressed his thumb against the play button. There was a soft hiss of tape, and then his father's voice filled the barn, low and steady and so familiar that Daniel felt his whole chest tighten. "If you're hearing this, son," his father said, "then I didn't make it to tell you in person. I'm sorry for that. I should have told you years ago. I should have brought you into all of this when you were old enough to carry it, but the truth is I was afraid. Not of you. Of what she would do if she found out you knew. So I waited. And I built quietly. And I left you a way to find it that only you would understand." There was a long pause. Daniel could hear his father's breathing on the tape, slow and uneven. "Don't be afraid of her," the voice continued. "Don't be afraid of any of them. You were never the smallest one in that room, Daniel. You were just the only one who wasn't shouting." The tape clicked softly and went still. Daniel sat in the quiet for a long while after the tape stopped. The light through the boards had shifted, gone deeper, the gold of late afternoon turning toward the rust of evening. He didn't cry. He'd expected to, and somewhere underneath everything he could feel the grief waiting like water held back by a thin wall, but right then the wall was holding. There was too much to do. His father had not left him a room to weep in. His father had left him a job to finish. He put the documents back into the leather folder, careful with each one. He wrapped the ledger and the cassette recorder back in their oilcloths and laid them in the strongbox. He locked it and slid it into a canvas feed sack he found hanging from a nail. Then he climbed back up to the loft, returned the brass key to its hollow beneath the loose plank, and set the plank gently in place. Some things belonged where his father had put them. He left the barn the way his father would have wanted, doors closed, bar dropped, the rope looped neatly around the rusted nail. He carried the feed sack across the muddy field toward the farmhouse, the strongbox heavy and warm against his hip. The farmhouse smelled of cold ash and dust when he stepped inside. He hadn't been in it since he was a teenager. The wallpaper in the hallway had faded to the color of weak tea, and the photographs along the wall hung slightly crooked, the way photographs do when no one has straightened them in years. He moved down the hall slowly. His mother's portrait hung at the far end, framed in plain dark wood. She died when he was 8, and he'd carried her face in his memory like a stone he was afraid to set down. He lifted the frame carefully off the wall. Behind it, taped to the back of the picture with yellowed masking tape, was a small brass key with a paper tag tied to it. The tag read in his father's hand, "First Valley, Box 412. Daniel held the key in his palm for a long moment. Then he set the picture back on the wall, straighter this time, and slid the key into his coat pocket beside the letters. He stayed in the farmhouse that night. He didn't sleep so much as lie down in the dark and listen to the house breathe around him. The wind moved through the eaves with a soft, steady sigh, and somewhere in the field a dog he couldn't see barked twice and went quiet. He turned the cassette recorder over in his hands in the dark, his thumb tracing the edge of it. He thought about his stepmother's smile in the drawing room. He thought about the way his older stepbrother had laughed at the funeral, that sharp single bark. He thought about his father sitting at the kitchen table writing in that small black ledger, year after year, knowing what was coming. He thought about Margaret on Pine Street. He thought about how long she had been waiting. He must have slept eventually because the next thing he knew the windows were pale with mourning, and a thin gray light was lying flat across the floorboards. He sat up slowly. His back ached. He washed his face at the kitchen sink with cold water that ran rust-colored for a full minute before it came clear. He looked at himself in the small mirror above the sink. His eyes looked different, not harder exactly, just settled, like something that had been spinning in him for years had finally found its weight. He drove into town a little after 8. The road wound through hills still damp from the rain, past fields where new grass had begun to push up through the matted brown of last year's growth. Pine Street was on the older side of town, where the buildings still had wooden signs, and the sidewalks were uneven from the roots of old maples. He found the law office between a bakery and a closed-up barber shop. The lettering on the window reads simply, Margaret L. Voss, Attorney at Law, established 1987. A small bell rang when he pushed the door open. A woman behind the desk looked up. She had silver hair pulled back into a neat low knot, and her eyes went very still when she saw him. "You're Charles's son," she said softly. "Sit down, Daniel. We have a great deal of work to do." Daniel sat. Margaret stood up slowly from behind her desk, came around it, and shook his hand the way old country lawyers shake hands, firm and unhurried, and without any of the false warmth city people use. She was small and trim, with eyes the color of a winter sky and a quietness about her that reminded him immediately of his father. She poured him a cup of coffee from a percolator in the corner without asking if he wanted one. She seemed to know. "I've been keeping a chair warm for you for 11 years, she said as she set the cup in front of him. "Your father told me you'd come when it was time. He said I'd know you the moment you walked in." He was right. Daniel didn't quite know what to say to that. He set the canvas feed sack on the floor beside his chair and unbuttoned his coat. Margaret sat down across from him, folded her hands on the desk, and waited. She didn't fill the silence. She let him find his footing in it. "I found the box," he said finally. "The barn, the loft, the ledger." Margaret nodded once. "Good," she said. "Then we can begin." She opened a drawer on her side of the desk and lifted out a thick brown accordion folder bound with 2 heavy elastic bands. She set it between them and laid her hand flat on top of it the way a person lays a hand on a Bible. "This is your father's working file," she said. "Every transfer, every filing, every notarized signature. He and I built this together over 11 years. There are duplicates of everything in your bank box, and a second set with my partner in Albany, in case anything ever happened to my office. Your father did not believe in single copies of important things." She slid the folder toward him. "Your stepmother will contest this," she said. "She'll contest it the moment her attorneys understand what they're looking at, which I expect will be sometime this week. She will try several things. She will try to claim the transfers were made under undue influence, that your father was not competent. She will try to claim the LLC was a sham. She will try to claim, and this is the one to brace yourself for, that you knew about the arrangement and manipulated your father into making it." Daniel looked up. "I didn't know anything about it." "I know you didn't," Margaret said gently. "Your father knew you didn't. That's the whole point. He kept you out of it on purpose, so that no one could ever claim you'd had a hand in it. There are letters in this folder from him to me, dated across the entire 11 years, stating clearly that you had no knowledge of the holdings. There are recordings of conversations between him and his physician confirming his mental competence at every stage. There is a videotaped statement he made 6 months ago, witnessed by myself and 2 other attorneys, explaining his decisions in his own words. Your father, Daniel, was a man who prepared for weather." Daniel let out a slow breath. He could feel something settling in him, the way silt settles to the bottom of a glass when you stop stirring it. He thought of his father at the kitchen table year after year, the small black ledger open in front of him. He had not been a bitter man. He had been a careful one. Margaret slid a second, thinner folder across the desk. "This one is the one I need you to read today," she said. "It's the formal notice of ownership. Once we file it, the corporate structure becomes a matter of public record. Your stepmother and stepbrothers will learn within 48 hours that the ground under every property they inherited is owned by an LLC in your name. After that, things will move quickly." Daniel opened the folder. The top page was a single sheet, clean and formal, with a line at the bottom for his signature. "Once I sign this," he said quietly, "there's no going back." Margaret looked at him steadily. "There was never a going back, Daniel. Your father made sure of that the day he filed the first transfer. The only choice in front of you is whether to step into what's already yours, or to let someone else spend the rest of her life pretending it isn't." Daniel picked up the pen. He signed his name slowly, the way his father had taught him to sign important things when he was a boy. Full name, no shortcuts, the pen pressed firmly enough that the ink would not fade. He set the pen down. Margaret took the page, blew gently across the signature, and slid it into a manila envelope already addressed to the county clerk's office. She sealed the envelope, set it on the corner of her desk, and pressed a small button on her phone. "Lillian," she said, "please run the Whitmore filing over to the courthouse this morning. Hand to Judge Halberd's clerk directly, no intermediaries." A young woman's voice came back through the speaker. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret looked up at Daniel. "Now," she said, "we wait. Not long. They'll know by Thursday at the latest. I'd like you to stay close to the farmhouse this week. Don't go to the estate house. Don't take meetings alone. If your stepmother calls, you let it go to voicemail and you call me. If your stepbrothers come to the property, you do not open the door without a witness. Do you understand?" Daniel nodded. "Good," she said. Her voice softened a little. "Your father was the most patient man I ever met, Daniel. He used to say that a slow truth is harder to argue with than a fast one. You're going to find that out this week. Let them do the shouting. You don't have to." He drove back to the farmhouse with the canvas sack on the seat beside him and the second folder tucked under his arm. The light over the hills had gone a soft pale gold, and the air through the open windows smelled of cut grass and wet stone. He stopped at a small grocery on the way and bought bread and coffee and a sack of apples and a wedge of cheese. The woman at the register looked at him a moment longer than was usual, and as she handed him his change, she said quietly, "You're Charles's boy, aren't you?" He nodded. She nodded back. "He was a good man," she said. "He spoke well of you." Daniel thanked her and walked out into the parking lot with his throat tight. The week passed slowly. He worked on the barns each morning. He scraped old paint from the second barn's siding and found, underneath the gray, the soft red his father had painted it the summer Daniel turned 7. He cleared brush from around the foundation of the farmhouse. He fixed the porch step that had sagged for as long as he could remember. He did not check his phone often. When it rang, it was usually Margaret with a small update, or the number of a person he didn't know, which he let pass. On Thursday afternoon, the first call came from his stepmother. He saw her name on the screen and let the phone buzz itself quiet on the kitchen counter. A minute later it buzzed again, then again. By the fourth call he silenced it without looking. By evening she had left 11 voicemails. He did not listen to them. He called Margaret. Margaret said, "Good," and then, "Don't listen to them yet. Bring the phone to my office in the morning and we'll listen together with a recorder running." On Friday morning they listened. His stepmother's voice came through the speaker in stages, each message a step further down a staircase. The first was cold and clipped and demanded he call her immediately. The third was tighter, the words coming faster. The sixth was shaking. By the 9th, she was no longer speaking to Daniel. She was speaking past him to whoever might be listening, building a record of her own, calling him ungrateful, calling him a thief, calling him a boy who had wormed his way into a sick man's confidence. The 11th was the quietest. She simply said, "Daniel, please call me. We can fix this." Then a long breath. Then the click. Margaret turned off the recorder. She made a note on a yellow pad and underlined it twice. "We have what we need," she said. "She is on tape accusing you in 9 different ways, none of which match. Her own lawyers will tell her to stop calling by tonight. From here on, she'll only speak to you through them." Daniel exhaled. "So what happens now?" he asked. Margaret looked at him over her reading glasses. "Now," she said, "we go to the estate house. Together." And we read the ground out from under their feet. They drove out to the estate house on Monday morning in Margaret's old gray sedan. She drove the way she did everything else, slowly and without wasted motion. Daniel sat in the passenger seat with the leather folder on his knees and watched the country roll by, low hills and white fences and the occasional barn leaning into the wind. He felt strangely calm. He had thought he would feel afraid, or angry, or some hot mixture of the two. Instead, he felt the way a man feels the morning of a long-planned harvest, quiet and ready, his hands steady on what they were holding. The estate house sat at the top of a long sweeping drive lined with poplars. White columns, slate roof, a fountain in the circle out front that his father had always thought was ridiculous. 3 cars were already parked in the gravel turnaround. His stepmother's white SUV. A black sedan that belonged, Margaret said as they pulled in, to her lead attorney. And a smaller silver car Daniel didn't recognize. Margaret turned off the engine and looked at him. "Remember," she said, You don't have to shout, you don't have to argue, you don't have to defend yourself. The papers do all of that. You're here to be present, that's all. Are you ready?" Daniel nodded. "Yes," he said. They walked up the wide stone steps together. The door opened before they reached it. His older stepbrother stood in the doorway, jaw tight, eyes already hard. He did not greet them. He stepped back without a word and let them in. The drawing room had been arranged like a courtroom. His stepmother sat at the long oak table in a charcoal suit, her hands folded in front of her, her face arranged into something she clearly hoped looked like composure. Her two sons sat on either side of her. Her attorney, a broad-shouldered man in an expensive gray suit, stood at the head of the table with a stack of papers in front of him. A fourth person, a thin woman in a dark blazer, sat slightly apart with a small recorder on the table beside her. The court reporter, Margaret, murmured under her breath, "Good. We want this on the record." Daniel took the chair Margaret indicated. She sat beside him. She set the leather folder on the table, opened it once, closed it, and folded her hands on top of it. She did not speak first. She waited. The stepmother's attorney cleared his throat. "Counselor," he said, addressing Margaret rather than Daniel, "my client wishes to express her shock and disappointment at the filings made last week. She believes there has been a profound misunderstanding, and she has authorized me to offer a generous settlement to her stepson in exchange for a withdrawal of the LLC's claims to the family properties." Margaret tilted her head slightly. "The LLC," she said, "does not claim the properties. It owns the land beneath them. That is a matter of public record as of Thursday afternoon. There is no claim to withdraw." His stepmother's mouth tightened, just a small motion at the corner. Her attorney kept going. "We are prepared to offer Mr. Whitmore a one-time payment of $2 million and the title to the farmhouse and barns free and clear in exchange for the dissolution of the LLC and the return of the ground parcels to the estate." Margaret looked at Daniel. He met her eyes. He shook his head once. Margaret turned back to the attorney. "We decline," she said. The room was very quiet for a moment. Then his stepmother spoke. Her voice was thin and cold, like a wire pulled tight. "Daniel," she said, "look at me." Daniel looked. "Your father was sick at the end," she said. "He was not himself. He let himself be influenced by people who do not understand this family." Daniel did not raise his voice. He simply reached into the folder, drew out a single sheet of paper, and slid it across the table toward her. It was the dated witness statement from his father's physician, signed and notarized 8 months before his death, affirming full mental competence. She did not pick it up. He drew out a second sheet. The transcript of the video statement his father had made before 3 attorneys in his own words, in his own voice. He drew out a third, a copy of the first page of the small black ledger. Her hand began to tremble. Margaret let the silence do its work. She did not rush to fill it. She did not lay out the rest of the documents in a flourish. She simply waited, hands folded over the leather folder, while the 3 papers Daniel had pushed across the table sat there like stones dropped into still water. His stepmother's attorney recovered first. He cleared his throat, picked up the physician's statement, and read it slowly. His face did not change, but something in his shoulders shifted, the small, involuntary settling of a man who has just understood that the case he came to argue is not the case in front of him. He set the page down. He looked at his client. He did not need to say anything. She had already read his face. "We will," he said carefully, "need time to review these materials." "Take all the time you need," Margaret said. "The filing stands. The LLC stands. The ground does not move." His younger stepbrother shoved his chair back from the table. "This is insane," he said. His voice cracked on the last word. He looked at Daniel like he was seeing him for the first time, and maybe Daniel thought he was. "You can't actually do this. You can't actually take this from us." "I'm not taking anything from you," Daniel said quietly. "You inherited the houses. They're still yours. You just don't own what they sit on. That was never yours to begin with." His older stepbrother said nothing. He was looking at his mother, and his mother was looking at the small black ledger page on the table in front of her, and Daniel watched her read the first entry, and the second, and the third, and he watched the color leave her face in slow stages, the way light leaves a room when the sun goes down. Margaret stood. Daniel stood with her. "We'll be in touch through counsel," she said. She picked up the leather folder. She did not offer her hand. They walked out of the drawing room together, down the long marble hall, past the portraits of grandfathers Daniel had never met, and out the heavy front door into the bright, cool morning. In the months that followed, the case never went to trial. His stepmother's attorneys reviewed the file his father had built, and within 3 weeks they had advised her, in writing, to settle. The settlement, when it came, was not generous. It was simply the end of a long, quiet contest she had not known she was losing for 11 years. She kept the estate house for her lifetime, with a clause requiring her to maintain it. The lake house was sold, with the proceeds split as the will had directed. The office tower in the city was sold to a buyer Margaret had quietly identified months before, and the proceeds went into a trust Daniel set up in his father's name, for scholarships at the small agricultural college 2 counties over where his father had gone as a young man. His stepbrothers did not speak to him for a long time. Then, slowly, the younger one did. He came out to the farm one Saturday morning that fall alone in jeans instead of a suit, and he stood at the gate for a long time before he opened it. He didn't apologize. Daniel didn't ask him to. They walked the fence line together, and at the end of it the younger one said, "He really did love you best, didn't he?" Daniel thought about it for a moment. "No," he said. "He just trusted me longest." The younger one nodded slowly and didn't say anything else, and they walked back to the house in the kind of silence that was not empty. Daniel kept the farm. He fixed the second barn the next spring, and the year after that he painted both of them the soft red his father had used. He kept the small black ledger on a shelf in the farmhouse, beside the brass key and the cassette recorder, and on quiet evenings he would sometimes take it down and read a single entry, no more, the way some people read a verse before bed. He never moved into the estate house. He never wanted to. The house his father had left him was the one that smelled of cedar and oil and old hay, the one with the loft where, on warm summer nights, he could still climb up with a blanket and lie back and find the constellations, one by one, exactly where his father had left them. If you believe truth always finds its way to light, no matter how deeply it's buried, share Daniel's story. Because sometimes what looks like nothing is the inheritance that changes everything.